Welcome. We've got some fascinating material here on Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. Now, Escobar himself, the king of cocaine, most people know that name.
Oh, absolutely. He's almost mythical.
Right. But our mission in this deep dive is really to look beyond just him, to uncover that essential network of allies, the people who actually made his empire possible.
It's a side of the story you don't always hear as much about, but it's crucial.
Exactly. So we're going to explore who these people were, what drove them, what they actually did, and what happened to them in the end.
We'll be covering quite a range.
Yeah, we'll hit the inner circle, corrupt officials, international partners, and, well, maybe even some connections that might surprise you. Okay, let's get into it. The inner circle first.
Sounds good. And what's really striking when you dig into the sources is just how varied that inner circle was. Different skills, even different worldviews.
Like Carlos later.
Exactly like later.
Right.
He wasn't just, moving product. His whole approach to logistics was innovative, especially setting up Norman's Cay in the Bahamas. That changed everything.
Norman's Cay, that wasn't just an airstrip, was it?
No. It was a dedicated transit hub. A private island basically turned into this linchpin for trafficking cocaine into the U.S. It really scaled up the whole operation massively.
A logistical game changer. And the sources paint him as this flamboyant character, too, right? With this odd fixation on Nazi ideology.
Yeah, quite eccentric. Flamboyant, definitely.
Yeah.
The Nazi thing is, well, it's bizarre, and it adds another layer to the kind of personalities Escobar managed to bring together.
It makes you wonder about Escobar's leadership, pulling these different, sometimes strange threads together.
Right. His ability to spot talent, or at least utility, even in unconventional people. Yeah. Then there's Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, El Mexicano.
The muscle.
Well, more than just muscle. He was the cartel's military strategist. He ran the armed groups, oversaw the often incredibly brutal operations.
Yeah.
But critically, his role in building alliances with Mexican traffickers. That was huge. Gacha really forged that link with the Guadalajara cartel with Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo.
Ah, so he laid the groundwork for getting the product north across the border.
Precisely. That partnership was strategically vital for hitting the North American market on a large scale. It wasn't just a chance connection. He actively built it.
So a strategist as well as an enforcer. And the sources definitely talk about his ruthlessness, assassinations, that sort of thing.
Oh, absolutely. Reputation for brutality. That was key to their control. Then you have a different flavor entirely with the Ochoa brothers.
Fabio, Jorge Luis, Juan David, the businessmen.
Kind of. They brought this veneer of legitimacy, maybe, through their, established cattle and horse ranching businesses.
Which were perfect for
money laundering. Exactly. Yep. Those legitimate businesses were ideal for washing the enormous amounts of cash coming in.
And they tried to keep up appearances, didn't they? Like respectable ranchers.
They did. The sources mention how they tried to portray themselves as honorable businessmen. And interestingly, they were also involved in negotiating surrender terms later on.
Trying to cut a deal, mitigate the fallout.
Seems likely. Maybe hedging their bets, trying to navigate both worlds. It shows a different kind of strategic thinking within that core group.
Which leads us pretty neatly into the whole issue of corruption. The scale of it was just staggering.
It really was. When you look at the sources, the way the cartel embedded itself into the Colombian state is quite shocking.
I mean, Escobar himself held a seat in Congress.
It says it all, doesn't it? It shows just how high that influence reached.
Yeah.
Bribes, intimidation. It became standard practice. It essentially bought them a level of immunity inside Colombia.
And the ultimate symbol of that immunity has to be La Catedral.
His personal prison. Unbelievable. Negotiating the terms of his own surrender to include building a luxury prison designed by him. It just highlights the power he still wielded.
Even when technically turning himself in. And this corruption, it wasn't just the top politicians. It went all the way down.
Oh, definitely. Police, military officials. The sources are clear that widespread corruption in law enforcement was fundamental to the cartel's success.
They weren't just looking the other way.
Sometimes, maybe, but often it was more active. Accepting bribes to ignore operations? Yeah, but also providing intelligence, info on rivals, on government plans.
Which is where that famous phrase comes in. Plata o plomo.
Silver or lead, exactly. It was brutal, simple, and terrifyingly effective. Cooperate, take the money, or face violence. That policy really created the climate of fear they needed.
It wasn't just about the money then. It was about undermining the very institutions meant to stop them. but their reach, it went way beyond Colombia.
Absolutely. The international connections were indispensable for a global operation like this.
We mentioned Mexico already with Gotcha and Gallardo. That was step one for North America.
Pivotal. That alliance with the Guadalajara cartel was the main pipeline into the U.S. market. The sources really stress this wasn't just buying and selling, it was a strategic partnership, hugely profitable for both sides.
Okay, so they get it into the U.S., but then they need people on the ground there, right, in the big cities.
For sure. Miami, L.A., New York. Yeah. The material points to allied trafficking groups in those key cities.
Yeah.
They handled the distribution, got the product out onto the streets.
And crucially, managed the money coming back.
Yes, the cash flow was immense. Laundering that much money required sophisticated networks. Offshore banks, played a big part in hiding it all.
Places like Panama, the Caymans.
Those were definitely key locations mentioned for concealing wealth. Those financial systems were just as vital as the smuggling routes.
And it wasn't just the Americas. They looked towards Europe, too.
They did. The sources talk about efforts to set up shop in Europe. Spain and the Netherlands often come up as key entry points.
Gateways to the rest of the continent. London, Paris.
Exactly. They needed allies there, too. People to handle the logistics within Europe. It shows the sheer scale of their ambition, a truly global network.
It's quite something to map out. But beyond these, let's say, expected criminal alliances, the sources hint at other connections too, right? Maybe less obvious ones.
Yeah, this is where it gets even more interesting, perhaps. Some accounts mention links, or at least interactions, with the entertainment world.
Celebrities.
Allegedly. Stories of celebrities attending these incredibly lavish cartel parties. Some sources suggest this helped, build Escobar's image, almost normalize him in certain circles in Colombia.
Right, these huge parties with famous musicians. It projects power, untouchability, like they operated outside normal rules.
Exactly. And then there's the sheer amount of money involved, billions, that inevitably touches the world of big business and finance.
So banks, financial institutions getting involved, knowingly or not.
The sources suggest that, yes, various institutions ended up facilitating the laundering, whether they fully understood the source or perhaps chose not to look too closely.
And those offshore banks we mentioned earlier were critical infrastructure for that. Hiding the money, moving it around.
Absolutely crucial. You can't run an empire that size without managing the finances. These networks were the financial lifeblood. But of course, this empire didn't last forever. Things started to unravel.
Yeah, the downfall involved its own complex dynamics, rivalries heating up, for instance.
Definitely. The conflict with the Cali cartel became a massive factor. The sources show this wasn't just a simple turf war anymore.
It became something else.
It evolved into the Cali cartel actually allying with the Colombian government specifically to take down Escobar. That was a huge shift in the power balance.
Wow, so rivals teaming up with the state, that must have given the government a serious edge.
Immense. Cali provided intelligence, resources. It really strengthened the government's hand, and that's partly what led to Operation Surge Block.
The Specialized Police Unit, with U.S. help.
That's the one. Trained, funded, specifically tasked with dismantling Escobar's network. And they had successes. The sources credit them with taking down key allies, like Gotcha and later. That really started to weaken Escobar's structure.
And then there was that other group, Los Pepes.
Ah, yes. People persecuted by Pablo Escobar. A shadowy outfit. The material describes them as this mix of former cartel associates, vigilantes, rivals, all united by their hatred of Escobar.
And they weren't playing by the rules either.
Not at all. Brutal tactics, systematically targeting Escobar's remaining allies, his family, his businesses, destroying his assets. While controversial, their actions definitely added to the pressure, destabilizing his network from within, creating this climate of intense fear and betrayal.
So with all this pressure, the government, Cali, Los Pepes,
Yeah.
What happened to the allies who were still left standing towards the end?
Well, as the sources detail, for many of the closest allies, at the end wasn't pretty. Often it was a violent death, or if they were lucky, maybe long prison sentences. That network he built became a target list.
A dangerous position to be in. And the legacy of all this, does it just end with Escobar's death?
Not really. The sources suggest the Medellin cartel, and specifically its network model, the way they built alliances, used corruption, went international, kind of became a blueprint.
For other criminal organizations.
Absolutely. You see similar tactics, similar structures in organized crime around the world even today. Studying Medellin offers real insights into how these global illicit operations work.
And the story itself, it just keeps fascinating people, doesn't it? Pop culture loves it.
It does. It continues to shape how we think about drug trafficking, about that whole era.
So wrapping this deep dive up, it's really clear, isn't it? Pablo Escobar, the single figure, gets the headlines. But his empire was impossible without this complex, sprawling web of allies.
Absolutely. Each connection, each individual or group played a part. Understanding that network gives you a much richer, more accurate picture of how the Medellin cartel actually functioned, both its rise and its eventual fall. It wasn't a one-man show.
Definitely not. And maybe a final thought for you to consider. Looking around today in our hyper-connected world, how much do these same dynamics, alliances, corruption, global reach still drive illicit activities? Not just drugs, but, everything else too. It's certainly...
Fidel Castro. Just saying the name. It really brings up strong feelings, doesn't it? For some, a revolutionary hero, standing up to a superpower.
And for others, a dictator. Ruthless, crushing dissent.
Exactly. That's the real tension, the core of it, and that's what we want to dig into today using the materials you've shared. We're not aiming for a simple label here.
No, definitely not. It's about understanding the complexities, his life, his policies, all the controversy that still swirls around him.
Right. The sources look pretty comprehensive, so hopefully we can get past those black and white views.
Yeah, I think so. We can look at what shaped him, the big things he did, and, the impact, both the good and the bad, based on what's in front of us.
The advancements and the undeniable hardships, too. So let's try and piece together a clearer picture of, his place in history from this information.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so where do we start with such a huge life? The beginning seems right. August 13th, 1926. Piran, Cuba.
And born into, relative privilege, actually. His father was a wealthy Spanish landowner.
Right, and his mother was a household servant. It's an interesting starting point, isn't it, that contrast?
It really is. You have this sort of comfortable upbringing set against the backdrop of Cuba's inequalities at the time. Maybe, an early spark.
Could be, for that later focus on social justice. And then his education, that seems key, too, according to the sources.
Oh, definitely. Law school, University of Havana. That's where he really dives into more radical ideas like Marxism.
So he's starting to build this framework for understanding power, society.
Exactly. He wasn't just, born a revolutionary. He was actively engaging with these challenging ideas.
And becoming quite the figure in student politics, it sounds like. Charismatic, good speaker. You sort of see the leader emerging.
Yeah, the seeds were there. Which leads us to 1953 and the Moncada barracks attack.
A huge moment. Even though it failed.
Right.
The attempt to overthrow Batista, the dictator.
It failed in the short term, yeah. But it became incredibly symbolic. That was the start of his real revolutionary journey in many ways.
And his imprisonment after that, plus the famous "History will absolve me" speech, that really put him on the map, didn't it?
Absolutely. It galvanized people, showed his commitment, and he was brilliant at shaping the narrative, even from jail.
Then he's released, goes into exile in Mexico.
And connects with others, crucially, Che Guevara.
Forming the 26th of July movement. So Mexico becomes this, planning ground.
A really critical period. A regrouping, strategizing, building that core team, setting the stage.
And then, 1959. They do it. Batista's out.
The revolution succeeds. And your sources probably capture that initial feeling, right? A wave of optimism.
Yeah, this real hope for equality and end to the corruption.
And they did bring in some major changes pretty quickly.
Like the land redistribution, breaking up those huge estates.
Giving land back to the peasants. That was fundamental. A massive shift in Cuban society, tackling that old inequality.
And then healthcare and education.
Yeah.
The sources highlight those too.
Yeah, big pushes there. Universal healthcare. And these national literacy campaigns.
Which apparently had a huge impact.
Seems so. Reports suggest literacy rates really jumped significantly. Tangible changes for ordinary people.
Okay, and also the nationalization of businesses, especially American ones.
Right. Taking control of foreign-owned companies, particularly U.S. corporations.
That must have struck a chord, national sovereignty, taking back control.
It definitely resonated with many Cubans and supporters internationally, especially on the left. But
it also created massive conflict with the U.S.
Exactly. That was a major point of friction. Seen as a direct challenge to American interests, it really set the stage for everything that followed.
Which kind of leads us into the darker side of the regime, as many sources describe it.
The suppression of dissent.
Yeah. It seems like opposition wasn't tolerated for long. Reports of arrests, jail.
Allegations of torture, executions too. Some sources mention potentially tens of thousands of political prisoners.
That's a staggering number.
Yeah.
It really highlights that shift, doesn't it, from revolutionary ideals to
Consolidating power. And often, that involves silencing anyone who disagrees, dismantling democratic norms, freedom of speech. Your sources likely detail this pattern.
and the censorship. Tight control over the media, banning books, art, music, that was critical.
Yeah, controlling the narrative. It's a classic tool of authoritarian regimes, right? Limit information, reinforce your own message.
Makes it hard for any alternative viewpoint to gain traction.
Exactly. Then you have the reports about human rights abuses more broadly.
The forced labor camps.
Yeah.
Some sources specifically mention the UMP camps.
Yes, the UMP camps, targeting political prisoners, but also LGBTQ individuals, religious groups.
Yeah.
Anyone considered deviant by the state.
It's such a jarring contrast to the social gains, like in literacy or healthcare.
It really is. It points to this inherent contradiction, pushing for equality in some areas while denying basic rights and dignity in others. The UMM camps are a particularly grim example of that.
And all this, the repression, the economic issues that came later,
Yeah.
led to people leaving.
A huge number of people, millions reportedly over the decades, fleeing the island.
Seeking freedom, maybe better economic chances elsewhere. The Mariel boat lift in 1980 stands out.
Over 125,000 people leaving in just a few months. That scale, it really speaks volumes about the situation for many Cubans.
You don't make that kind of journey lightly.
No, absolutely not. It suggests a profound level of, well, desperation or dissatisfaction.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the international stage. Castro's influence there was huge, right?
Undeniably, especially during the Cold War, aligning Cuba with the Soviet Union.
That put Cuba right at the center of global politics, a small island nation playing a massive role.
It's quite remarkable. That Soviet alignment brought crucial support, economic, military, but also made Cuba a flashpoint.
Which leads directly to the Bay of Pigs invasion in '61, the failed U.S.-backed attempt to oust him.
Right, and ironically, as many accounts suggest, that failure probably strengthened Castro's position at home.
And definitely ramped up the anti-American feeling.
Absolutely. It likely confirmed his fears about the U.S., solidified the Soviet alliance in his mind, and, well, it was great propaganda for the regime, David versus Goliath.
And then the really big one, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962.
I mean, the world holding its breath.
Castro agreeing to host Soviet nuclear missiles, bringing us to the brink of nuclear war.
It's hard to overstate the danger of that moment. It cemented his image as, defiant, willing to stare down the U.S.
But also the risk. It was immense, globally.
Enormous risk. It showed his commitment to the alliance, but wow.
Beyond the superpower conflict, Cuba was also very active in supporting revolutionary movements elsewhere, wasn't it?
Yes, very much so. In Latin America, Africa, Asia, funding, training, ideological support.
Which had a real impact, especially in anti-colonial struggles. He was seen as a hero by many in the developing world for that.
Definitely. It positioned Cuba as this symbol of solidarity, with oppressed people globally, even while things at home were drawing criticism. That internationalist stance is a big part of his legacy.
But let's put it back home to Cuba's economy. It became very dependent on the Soviet Union.
Critically dependent. So when the USSR collapsed in 1991.
Disaster for Cuba. The special period.
Exactly. Severe shortages, extreme hardship. The sources describe a really desperate time. It just exposed how vulnerable the economy was.
Forced the government into some changes, right?
Yeah.
Austerity, looking for other options.
Yeah, they had to adapt. We saw some limited market reforms later on.
And opening up to tourism, trying to bring in cash.
Right. Pragmatic moves, really, driven by necessity, but always carefully managed.
The state kept a tight grip on the overall economy.
Oh, absolutely. There was no fundamental shift away from the socialist model. The state remained dominant.
And then Fidel Castro dies, November 25th, 2016.
But the debate, the controversy, it didn't die with him. It's still very much alive.
You still have those two very strong opposing views.
Yeah.
On one side, the supporters.
Who see him as this icon of resistance, right, against imperialism,
Yeah.
the guy who brought healthcare, education, dignity to millions.
National sovereignty, social justice, that's the narrative there, often highlighted in the materials. The achievements are emphasized.
Definitely. Healthcare, literacy, those are pointed to as proof of his commitment to the people.
But then the other side, the critics.
And their view, also reflected in the sources, is starkly different. An authoritarian. Someone whose policies choked the economy, isolated Cuba.
And crushed basic freedoms.
Exactly. They focus on the human costs, The political prisoners, the censorship, the economic hardship that drove so many to leave. For them, it's a legacy of oppression.
So it leaves us with these really big, tough questions, looking back at all this information, like, was the revolution necessary to fix injustice, or did it just swap one type of oppression for another?
That's the fundamental dilemma with so many revolutions, isn't it? Do the ends justify the means? Were the initial goals worth the methods used? There are no easy answers there.
And how do you weigh things? Those reported improvements in health and education against the human rights abuses.
Can you even weigh them against each other? It's a profound ethical challenge. Can social progress ever excuse violating fundamental rights? People land differently on that, based on their own values.
And the final question, maybe, how does all this still shape Cuba today? His presence feels like it looms large, even after his death.
It really does. His ideology, the systems he built, political, economic, they're still the foundation of Cuban society, as your sources likely show. So understanding his legacy in all its complexity.
It's essential to understanding Cuba now and where it might go.
Precisely.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, based on the materials you shared, it's clear Fidel Castro's legacy is, well, incredibly complex. No simple takeaways.
Deeply polarizing. His impact was huge, and it's still felt today.
And trying to understand it means really engaging with all these different perspectives, acknowledging the achievements reported by some,
And the very real human cost highlighted by others.
Hopefully, our discussion today, looking through these sources, gives you a better framework for thinking about him, about revolutionary figures in general, and, the long-term consequences.
Maybe it encourages you to keep exploring, to think about your own answers to those big questions. You know that famous picture, right? Che Guevara. The beret, the intense look. He's become such an icon, a symbol of rebellion, really.
He absolutely has.
Yeah.
But that image, it often tells just one part of the story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There's a whole lot more complexity there, maybe some darker shades too.
That's exactly what we're getting into today. People focus on the revolutionary fire, the fight for social justice, but we want to look at the less discussed parts, his secret missions, and importantly, the executions.
Yeah, digging into those aspects. The idea isn't to just tear down the image, but to understand the full picture. Our mission here is to really explore the moral gray areas, the contradictions that come up when you look closely.
Exactly. We're drawing on sources that zero in on those clandestine operations, what happened with the executions, and the sort of ethical tightrope he was walking, or maybe not walking.
And these sources, they really challenge that, simplified hero narrative. They force you to grapple with some uncomfortable truths about revolutions and the people who lead them.
Okay, so let's maybe unpack this a bit. Ernesto Che Guevara, born in Argentina in 1928. Not exactly the background you'd maybe predict for a communist revolutionary.
No, not at all. Came from a fairly well-off family, actually. But those travels he took through Latin America, that seems to have been the real catalyst.
Seeing the poverty, the injustice firsthand?
Precisely. It really radicalized him. That famous motorcycle trip especially, it seems to have fundamentally shifted his perspective, exposed him to the reality on the ground.
Right. That firsthand experience sounds crucial. And then the big moment, meeting Fidel Castro, Mexico, 1955, that feels like the point of no return almost.
Absolutely. That meeting was pivotal. He didn't just join the cause. He quickly became, a core part of it. A key strategist, Castro's trusted ally. His rise was pretty meteoric.
Which leads us into this whole world of secrecy. It wasn't all about open battles, was it? He was apparently quite adept at operating, behind the scenes.
Oh, definitely. Let's talk about Cuba first. Against Batista. His role in shaping their guerrilla tactics was huge.
What did that involve, specifically?
Well, secrecy was key. He really pushed the idea of small, hidden cells, blending in with the population. And he was a big believer in that FOCO theory.
FOCO theory. Remind us.
Basically, the idea that a small group of dedicated revolutionaries, a FOCO, or focus point, could ignite a much larger popular uprising just through their actions. It relies heavily on stealth, surprise attacks, being unseen until you strike.
So guerrilla warfare 101, almost, but with this specific ideological underpinning.
Exactly. And it worked. I mean, it worked in Cuba.
Yeah.
But as we'll see, that theory wasn't maybe as universally applicable as he thought. Local context turned out to be incredibly important.
Right. So the success in Cuba depended on those specific conditions. And this preference for secrecy, it carried on after Cuba, didn't it? Like the mission to the Congo in '65, that's not something you hear about as often.
No, it isn't. And there was a lot of secrecy around that one. The goal was basically exporting the revolution, supporting local rebels against the government there, which had Western backing.
And keeping it quiet was important for his image.
Very much so, it seems. maintaining that aura of the, infallible revolutionary leader. The problem was the mission didn't go well.
Failure. How so?
Well, multiple things. They didn't get the local support they expected. Resources were thin. Logistics were a nightmare. It was just a totally different situation than Cuba.
So a reality check.
A major one. It was apparently quite frustrating for Guevara. And the failure was, well, kept pretty quiet to protect that revolutionary image.
Okay, so Congo doesn't work out. Then comes Bolivia in 1966. The last attempt, right? And again, secretive.
Very secretive initially. The ambition was huge this time, sparking a continent-wide revolution, starting from Bolivia. He even used an alias, Ramon.
But the same problems popped up again.
Yeah, and maybe even worse. Lack of local peasant support was a massive issue. Their intelligence about the area, the politics, it was apparently flawed. Strategic mistakes were made. They ended up isolated.
So despite trying to operate under the radar,
It just didn't work. The local people weren't joining, the terrain was tough, and the Bolivian army, with U.S. help, started closing in. The secrecy couldn't fix the fundamental problems with the plan.
okay. Now, we need to shift gears to something even more difficult, the executions. After the revolution's success in Cuba, Che was put in charge of La Cabaña Fortress in Havana.
Yes, and this is where the story takes a significantly darker turn for many. His role there involved overseeing trials, detentions, and, yes, executions.
Executions of whom? Who were these enemies of the revolution?
Primarily, they were people linked to the old Batista regime. Soldiers, officials, suspected spies, people accused of being counter-revolutionary.
And the justification was?
Necessity. That these actions were needed to protect the revolution, to stop any potential comeback from Batista loyalists or interference from outside, securing the victory.
But the numbers were quite high, weren't they? Hundreds, reportedly. And the process. It wasn't exactly standard legal procedure.
That's the crux of the controversy, really. Many executions happen after very swift trials, or sometimes, allegedly, with little formal process at all. It was done under the banner of revolutionary justice.
Revolutionary justice.
Meaning, essentially, that the normal rules didn't apply. Guevara himself seemed to believe that proper, lengthy trials would hinder the revolution, slow it down.
Yeah.
The priority was consolidating power and eliminating threats.
So due process kind of went out the window.
It certainly appears that way in many cases, and historians still debate this intensely. Was he blinded by revolutionary zeal, overlooking basic human rights? Or was it a calculated, if brutal, necessity in that specific violent context? His Marxist-Leninist ideology definitely provided a framework for seeing violence as a tool against class enemies.
It puts you on that moral tightrope again, doesn't it? Considering the justification. How did he personally frame it?
Ideologically, it fit within that framework. Violence as a necessary tool for radical change. There's that famous or infamous quote attributed to him. "We have no time for justice. The only justice is revolutionary justice."
Wow. No time for justice. That's stark.
It really sums up that ruthless pragmatism.
And it forces you to ask, was this truly necessary for survival, or did it become about political control, using fear? Did the sources mention any dissent about this within the movement itself, concerns about mistakes?
That's the core question, isn't it? The sources definitely highlight the brutality and the chaos of that period. While the threat from Batista's people was real, the way things were handled, the speed, the lack of appeals, it raises serious questions about the motivations and whether it went too far. Even for those supporting the revolution, it remains a deeply debated aspect.
So you've got this figure, instantly recognizable, a global symbol for fighting the power, helping the oppressed, and then you stack up these secret missions, these executions. It's jarring.
It absolutely is. The popular myth, the heroic narrative, often just glosses over these parts. His commitment to social justice might seem clear to his supporters, but the methods, the secrecy, the executions, they force a much harder look.
It makes you question the very nature of revolutionary movements, I suppose. Even noble goals can get tangled up in questionable actions.
Right. And that famous Corda photograph,
Mm-hmm.
it's become so commercialized, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Almost detached from the actual man and his full history.
Yeah, the T-shirt doesn't really tell you about La Cabaña.
Exactly. The symbol takes on a life of its own, separate from the complex and sometimes brutal reality.
And his own story, his own life, ended in Bolivia in 1967. Another chapter with its own drama and, again, secrecy.
Right. That final attempt to export revolution failed spectacularly. He was captured by the Bolivian army, who had help from the CIA.
And executed shortly after. Which, ironically perhaps, only amplified his martyr status for many.
It certainly did. His death became another potent symbol. And even the circumstances around his capture and execution, the exact details, they're still debated, still somewhat shrouded.
Adding to the mystique, and then the whole business with his body.
Yes. Hidden by the Bolivian government for decades. It wasn't until 1997, 30 years later, that his remains were found, identified, and sent back to Cuba.
Buried with honors there now, right? In a big mausoleum.
That's right. But the fact that his burial site was kept secret for so long just added another layer to the whole Che enigma.
So when you try to sum it all up, it's incredibly complicated, isn't it? Hero or villain, it feels too simple.
It absolutely is too simple. You have the fight against imperialism, the push for social justice on one side. On the other, you have these clandestine methods, the ruthlessness, the executions. Trying to understand Che Guevara means you have to look at all of it.
You can't just pick the parts you like.
No. His story is a powerful and frankly disturbing look at the costs of revolution, the moral compromises, the darkness that can accompany even idealistic goals.
So maybe the thought to leave everyone with is this. When you're talking about revolutionary change, where is that line? Do the ends ever truly justify means like secrecy and summary executions? And what are the long-term effects when those lines get crossed? Chaz's story, with all its contradictions, really forces you to confront those questions head on. September 11th, you hear that date. And, well, 2001 probably jumps to mind for most people.
Almost instantly, yeah.
But today we're looking at a different September 11th. We're going back to 1973, thousands of miles away in Chile.
A really pivotal day. That's when a democratically elected government was violently overthrown.
And it really set the stage for, well, a pretty profound and often brutal period of change.
Exactly. So this deep dive, we're exploring Augusto Pinochet's rise to power in Chile and, the kind of regime he built afterwards.
Our guide for this is a pretty comprehensive overview document detailing that whole era.
Right. It gives us a solid base to unpack everything.
So your mission, as you listen along, is basically to get a clear picture of the key events leading up to Pinochet.
Uh-huh. And what his government was actually like.
Yeah, the characteristics of it, those economic policies he put in place.
And how the rest of the world reacted. Because that was, well, complicated.
Definitely. We want you to walk away with a concise but, thorough understanding of this really significant chapter in Latin American history.
And it's all drawn from this overview we've been digging through. It lets us really get into the timeline and the core issues.
Okay, let's dive in then. Augusto Pinochet, born 1915, career military man.
Mm-hmm. Climbed the ranks steadily.
But things really took a sharp turn for him and for Chile with Salvador Allende's election in 1970. What was Chile like politically then?
Well, Allende's election was huge. He was a democratically elected socialist. First time globally, actually.
Really?
Yeah. And his government went for policies like nationalizing big industries, copper especially, and trying to redistribute wealth.
Policies that would have really resonated with the working class, I imagine.
Definitely. Especially those who felt left out historically.
But it's always the way, isn't it? Big changes like that, they worry people too. Who was pushing back against Allende?
You had a few key groups. The U.S. government, for one. They saw Allende's socialism through that Cold War lens. Very suspicious.
Trying to stop communism spreading.
Pretty much. And then domestically, you had powerful Chilean business groups. They were obviously worried about nationalization, how it would hit their bottom line.
And our source mentions it wasn't purely ideological. Chile was apparently facing some real economic headwinds under Allende, too.
That's a really important point. Yeah, there were economic difficulties, inflation, shortages.
Things the military could later point to.
Exactly. That instability became part of the justification or pretext for intervening.
Which brings us back to that date. September 11th, 1973. Not just a leadership change, but, well, violent. Decisive.
Absolutely. The military launched this coordinated coup.
Yeah.
Pinochet, as head of the army by then, was right at the center of planning it.
And they attacked the presidential palace, La Moneda.
Yeah, a very symbolic act, the heart of the government under fire.
Allende's own fate. Still debated, isn't it?
Very much so. The regime's official story was suicide during the coup.
But that's been heavily disputed.
Widely disputed, yeah. The exact circumstances are still murky. But however it happened, it was a brutal end to Chile's democratic path at that moment.
So almost instantly, a military junta is in charge. Pinochet at the top. What did they do first to lock down power?
They moved fast. Dissolved Congress. Just got rid of it.
Wow.
Suspended the Constitution. Imposed martial law. Basically shut down all normal political life.
Concentrated all power in their hands.
Completely. No room for opposition.
And internationally, how did the world react right away? seemed split.
It really was. The U.S., some other Western countries, they were pretty quick to recognize the new regime, even offer support.
Why so quick?
Well, largely geopolitical aims. Reversing socialist trends in the region was, a big goal for them during the Cold War.
But that initial support, it doesn't capture what came next. The period often called a reign of terror. What did that mean for ordinary Chileans?
It meant living under a brutal dictatorship, systematic suppression of anyone seen as an opponent, ruthless.
Creating this pervasive climate of fear.
Absolutely. Basic human rights just went out the window.
And the scale of repression, mass arrests, executions, it's staggering.
It is. The overview we looked at estimates over 3,000 Chileans were executed or just disappeared under Pinochet.
And this wasn't random violence, was it?
No. It was targeted, aimed squarely at suspected leftists, trade union members, anyone considered a political threat to the junta.
We hear about places like Villa Grimaldi, Colonia Dignidad becoming notorious.
Infamous centers for detention and torture. Horrific things happen there.
All kinds of things.
Systematic torture. Electrical shocks, beatings, mock executions. Methods designed to break people, extract confessions, and just terrify the population.
Beyond executions, you mentioned the disappeared, people abducted, never seen again. What was the purpose of that tactic?
It was insidious. It sowed this deep fear and uncertainty. You eliminate opponents, yes, but you also leave families in agony, not knowing. It paralyzes potential resistance.
And for those who escaped into exile,
many fled to nearby countries like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. But they didn't just disappear quietly. Many continued to organize, speak out against the regime from abroad, kept the resistance alive.
And driving a lot of this repression was DNA, the National Intelligence Directorate, Pinochet's secret police.
Exactly. DNA was the main engine of the repression. Surveillance, arrests, torture, executions, that was their job.
Making everyone feel watched.
Constantly monitored. It created this oppressive atmosphere where even ordinary people felt unsafe, felt the fear.
Control wasn't just physical, though. Pinochet clamped down hard on information, too, right? Censorship.
Oh, completely. Strict censorship across all media. Newspapers, radio, TV.
Critical voices silenced.
Either shut down entirely or forced to just toe the government line. Journalists who tried to report the truth faced arrest or had to flee the country.
But even then, people tried to get the truth out. Our overview mentions an underground press.
Yeah, remarkably, yes. Brave individuals inside Chile ran clandestine news operations. And some international journalists took huge risks to report on the abuses.
Shining a light on it for the world.
They played a crucial role, definitely, despite the dangers.
Okay, let's pivot a bit. Let's talk economics under Pinochet. He brought in this group, the Chicago Boys. What was their whole approach?
Right, the Chicago Boys. Chilean economists, mostly trained at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman, big believers in neoliberal ideas. Meaning free markets, less government intervention. They believed that was the key to efficiency and growth.
So what did that look like in practice in Chile? What reforms did they push?
The big ones were privatization, selling off state-owned companies, deregulation across the board, and significant cuts to government spending on social programs.
Creating a market-driven system.
That was the goal, yeah.
And the results? Our overview paints a complex picture, some good, some bad.
It's definitely mixed. Supporters point to periods of economic growth, lower inflation eventually, but critics highlight a massive increase in inequality.
Who suffered most?
The working class, the rural poor. They saw rising poverty, rising unemployment, especially early on. And even later, while GDP might have grown, critics argue it was built on shaky foundations and didn't benefit everyone. It's that classic debate, isn't it? Efficiency versus equity.
Privatizing things like the copper mines. That must have been huge for Chile.
A massive deal. Copper was and is vital. Selling state control to private investors, often foreign ones, raised big questions about who really benefits from Chile's natural wealth. And it increased foreign dependence.
And cutting social spending, education, healthcare, pensions.
That hit vulnerable people hard. Reduced access, often lower quality for those who couldn't afford private options. Widened the gap between rich and poor.
So fundamentally different ways of seeing these economic policies then.
Absolutely. Supporters say they were tough, but necessary medicine to fix the economy after Allende's turmoil. Critics say the crisis was basically used as cover to install an authoritarian, elitist economic model.
Okay, let's zoom back out to the international picture. We mentioned early U.S. support. Why were Nixon and Ford so supportive of the coup?
Primarily, it was the Cold War. Preventing another socialist or communist state in Latin America was a top priority for Washington.
So they provided aid, intelligence.
Yes, financial aid, intelligence support for the junta. It was active backing.
And it seems the U.S. kind of looked the other way when reports of human rights abuses started coming out.
For a time, yes. The administrations prioritized the geopolitical angle over loudly condemning the violations. That stance has drawn a lot of criticism since, obviously.
But not everyone was quiet. There was international outcry, too.
Oh, yes, widespread condemnation from many countries, international organizations, and activists.
Groups like Amnesty International.
Exactly. Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, they were crucial in documenting the torture, the disappearances, the executions. They publicized what was happening.
Making Pinochet a symbol of dictatorship.
A global symbol of dictatorship and oppression, yeah. Their work was vital.
So, wrapping up this deep dive then, we've covered Pinochet's rise via that violent coup.
The brutal nature of the regime, the human rights abuses.
Those controversial neoliberal economic policies and their impact.
And the very divided international reaction.
Hopefully you, the listener, now have a much clearer grasp of this complex and, frankly, tragic period in Chile's history.
Yeah, it covered a lot of ground. You should have a solid handle on the key elements of Pinochet's rule. You know, thinking about it, the legacy of that time, it still shapes Chile today, doesn't it? Socially, politically.
That's a really important point. And it makes you think, doesn't it? Considering how political ideology, economic pressures, international gamesmanship all played a role, do we see echoes of those dynamics playing out elsewhere in the world today? What does the whole Pinochet story tell you, ultimately, about the long-term costs of choosing certain values, say, economic stability or anti-communism over others, like democracy and human rights? Something powerful to reflect on.
So, the name Hugo Chavez, it still really sparks intense debate, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. You have this figure promising such radical change in Venezuela.
A country with just, well, enormous potential.
Exactly, brimming with it. And yet the outcome we see today is this deep, ongoing crisis.
Makes you really wonder, you know, beyond the headlines, what were the fundamental shifts happening? The hidden gears turning, sort of, that led to this really dramatic decline.
Yeah, what was going on beneath the surface?
Okay, let's try and unpack some of that. Today on the Deep Dive, we're taking a close look at the presidency of Hugo Chavez.
Right, from his rise in 1999 right through to his death in 2013.
And we're drawing on some pretty detailed accounts looking at his time in power, his policies, and, well, the impact they eventually had.
The goal here, I think, is to move past the sort of simple narratives you often hear.
Yeah, get beyond the surface level. We want to really understand the core factors, the things maybe often overlooked, that shaped Chavez's Venezuela.
And which ultimately seem to have paved the way for the challenges the country faces now.
So consider this your focused exploration, a shortcut, really, into a pivotal and, let's face it, a really compelling story.
It is compelling. And right from the start, what's striking is that contrast, isn't it? Between the huge hope Chavez first inspired and the stark reality that unfolded later.
His rise wasn't exactly out of the blue, though. Our sources point out it tapped into something powerful.
Oh, absolutely. A really strong current of public discontent, that 1992 coup attempt. Even though it failed,
right.
It just resonated so deeply. You had a population feeling ignored, betrayed by the political establishment.
Especially the corruption under Perez that's mentioned a lot.
Exactly. So Chavez came across as this alternative, someone willing to actually challenge the status quo, and dramatically.
And that anti-establishment feeling, that wave, it really fueled the creation of his political movement, the Fifth Republic movement, MBR.
Yes. And when you look at the 1998 election...
It wasn't just a win, it was a landslide.
A huge landslide. It was this massive expression of a desire for fundamental change.
And he made these incredibly powerful promises, didn't he? Harnessing Venezuela's oil well.
A vast oil well.
To finally tackle poverty, inequality, things that had plagued the country for years.
And that message, well, it just connected. It connected profoundly with people who lived through years of instability, economic hardship.
Political turmoil.
Yeah, indeed. And then, you know, the timing. His early years in office coincided with this incredible surge in global oil prices.
They're almost perfect timing in a way.
For Venezuela, sitting on these enormous reserves, it meant this unprecedented flood of money coming in.
Which allowed him to fund those big social programs people remember.
That's right. The Misiones, like Mission Barrio Adentro for public health, Mission Robinson for education.
Aimed at marginalized communities, right?
Exactly, targeting those who felt left out. And initially, it really did seem like tangible progress was happening. People felt it.
It certainly created that appearance, yeah.
Yeah.
But this is where it gets complicated, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because what our sources really emphasize is Venezuela's, well, its dangerous over-reliance on that oil money.
Precarious is a good word for it. While the high prices brought in all that wealth,
It also made the whole country incredibly vulnerable, totally exposed to price swings.
and crucially, the sources point out, there was this real lack of effort to diversify the economy, to move beyond just oil.
That one single commodity became everything. The linchpin for the entire national budget, it seems.
Which really raises some critical questions, doesn't it, about the underlying goal of all that spending?
You mean, were the social programs the only goal?
Well, they certainly had some short-term benefits, no doubt, but the analysis we're looking at suggests that a significant chunk of that oil money might have been channeled more towards, let's say, consolidating political control rather than building truly sustainable economic development.
Okay, so the secret agenda perspective comes in here.
Sort of. When you see large sums going to populist projects that, well, maybe didn't have much long-term viability, and these oil deals with allies like Cuba, often under pretty opaque terms.
Not very transparent.
No. It does make you question if the main goal was genuine national progress, or was it more about securing a loyal base? Buying support, essentially.
Right. And the materials we reviewed do mention those accusations.
Yeah.
Cronyism, resources not always used efficiently.
Lavish projects that maybe looked good but didn't generate lasting economic activity.
And those oil agreements, seeming more political than economically sound for Venezuela itself in the long run.
Yeah, it paints a picture of priorities that might not have been solely focused on long-term national well-being.
In that context, that spending pattern, it's pretty crucial for understanding another aspect that emerges strongly from the sources.
Which is?
The increasing suppression of political opposition.
Ah, yes. The sources detail this gradual but very persistent chipping away at independent institutions.
The checks and balances you need in a democracy.
Exactly. Early on, constitutional reforms were pushed through that effectively concentrated more power in the executive, weakened those checks.
And it wasn't just dry institutional stuff, was it? The rhetoric got really aggressive.
Oh, definitely. The sources really highlight that. Anyone who voiced dissent, any critics,
Were labeled traitors, enemies of the state.
commonplace labels, and often amplified, pushed out through state-controlled media outlets.
Which, as we know, became increasingly dominant in shaping the narrative.
Precisely. So the space for actual free expression, for a free press, it just kept shrinking.
The RCTV shutdown in 2007 is mentioned frequently as a key moment.
A real turning point. Closing a major independent TV station sent a very clear message. There are limits to what you can say. Criticize too much, and you could be silenced.
So the analysis we're seeing suggests this kind of duality, this hidden aspect.
How so?
Well, the populist and anti-imperialist language was very strong, very outward-facing.
Yes, defending sovereignty.
Right. But underneath that, potentially masking these increasingly authoritarian moves, weakening democratic safeguards, controlling the media.
Limiting the public's access to different viewpoints, to critical perspectives, it all fits that pattern.
And alongside this political dimension, there's the whole issue of corruption and just, well, mismanagement.
Yeah, that's another really prominent theme in the source material. Despite Chavez often calling for transparency.
Right, the rhetoric was there.
The reality seems to have been widespread problems. PDVSA, the state oil company, is like a case study in itself.
What happened there?
Well, it was once seen as pretty efficient, quite well regarded internationally,
Okay.
but it became increasingly politicized. Key jobs often went to Chavez loyalists, many apparently lacking the deep technical expertise needed.
And the result?
Inefficiency,
Right.
allegations of embezzlement, and critically, a decline in actual oil production, which, given the economy's dependence,
Was a huge problem brewing.
a massive problem. And it wasn't just PDVSA, according to these accounts.
Corruption was wider.
Allegations point to it being present at multiple levels of government, talk of oil profits being siphoned off.
Offshore accounts, things like that.
Mentions of that, yes. And these questionable deals, not just with Cuba, but allies like Iran, Russia too.
So the picture emerging is one where A lot of wealth potentially accumulated with the ruling elite.
While essential things like infrastructure, public services were maybe deteriorating.
Okay, connecting that back to the governance style.
Yeah.
Does the analysis suggest Chavez's tight grip on power actually enabled this?
It seems to strongly suggest that yes, that the consolidation of power created an environment where corruption could perhaps thrive with less oversight, less accountability.
A patronage system. Loyalty rewarded, maybe tuning a blind eye.
The sources describe something like that, a system where loyalty was key and corruption might have been protected. And those international alliances you mentioned, while presented as solidarity, might have also facilitated these less transparent financial flows that didn't necessarily help ordinary Venezuelans.
And the state getting more involved in big parts of the economy without strong checks.
Right. It likely increased opportunities for inefficiency, maybe even graft, just because the accountability mechanisms weren't robust enough.
Okay, so while all this is happening, the oil boom, the political shifts, the corruption issues, there's also the rise of the Chavista movement itself.
Yes, this powerful ideological force. It was a real mix, wasn't it?
Socialism, Bolivarianism, that strong identification with Simón Bolívar.
And a very strong anti-imperialist, particularly anti-U.S. stance.
And it created this incredibly loyal base of support for Chavez and his vision. People who truly believed in it.
Definitely. But what's also really interesting and highlighted in the sources is the parallel rise of the military's influence.
Also,
Chavez started appointing more and more military figures to important civilian government jobs.
blurring the lines between the military and the state.
Exactly. That connection just got deeper and deeper over his time in power. And then as his health started to decline,
Right, towards
the military's role in just maintaining political stability, holding things together, became even more crucial.
which undoubtedly played into who came next. His successor, Nicolas Maduro.
The sources remind us his background wasn't military, former bus driver, union leader.
But crucially,
He had cultivated very close ties within that military establishment.
and that connection seems key to how he managed to consolidate and hold on to power after Chavez died.
The analysis we're seeing really suggests that Chavez's reliance on the military wasn't just incidental, it was strategic.
A key part of maintaining control and maybe suppressing dissent.
That's what's argued, that the armed forces became absolutely vital for ensuring the Chavista project continued.
But the consequence.
Well, this deep involvement of the military in politics raises serious concerns, accusations of militarization, the further weakening of democratic checks and balances.
Now, all these threads, the oil dependence, the political clampdown, the corruption, the military's role, they all lead towards the eventual, well, devastating outcome.
The collapse of Venezuela's economy.
Yeah. I mean, by the time Chavez died in 2013, even after that whole decade of sky-high oil prices.
The foundations were already shaky. The country was vulnerable.
But what happened under Maduro?
Yeah.
It was just catastrophic, wasn't it?
Truly. Oil production plummeted even further. Inflation went through the roof.
Hyperinflation. Unimaginable level.
Exactly. Widespread shortages of absolutely basic goods, food, medicine.
Leading to that mass exodus. Millions of Venezuelans just fleeing the country.
And our sources really trace the roots of this collapse back to Chavez's era, those economic policies.
The heavy reliance on oil, you mean?
Yes, that, but also the price controls, the currency manipulation. They created huge distortions in the economy.
Made normal business almost impossible in some sectors.
Right.
Yeah.
And the fundamental failure to diversify, to seriously invest in other industries, in infrastructure.
And to tackle that corruption we talked about.
All of it together. It essentially laid the groundwork for the implosion that followed. It seems the focus on short-term populist gains.
Like the Misiones, perhaps.
Possibly. That focus ultimately undermined any chance of long-term sustainable growth. It created this incredibly fragile system, totally dependent on oil prices.
And when those prices eventually fell.
The whole house of cards came down. It was acutely vulnerable to those external shocks.
That's a really crucial point, isn't it? That despite all the promises of prosperity, that sea of happiness he talked about,
The underlying structural problems in the economy were just never really fixed, maybe even made worse.
consequently, when you look at Chavez's legacy today, it's just incredibly contested, fiercely debated.
Absolutely. The sources show that clearly. For some, especially across parts of Latin America, he's still this icon.
A symbol of resistance,
Yeah.
champion of the poor, defying the U.S.
Exactly. That narrative is still very powerful for his supporters.
But for critics,
He's seen as the architect of Venezuela's tragedy, the leader who squandered unimaginable oil wealth, systematically undermined democracy.
And created this deeply corrupt system that led to ruin.
Two completely opposing views.
And the reality, as is so often the case, is probably much more complex.
Multifaceted.
You have to acknowledge, I think, there were genuine efforts, particularly early on, to improve social welfare for the poor. You can't just dismiss that.
No, you can't. But those efforts were deeply intertwined with these profound failures in governance, in economic management.
And the erosion of democratic norms.
His ideology, Bolivarianism, Chavismo. It's definitely left a lasting mark on Venezuela and the region.
No doubt. But it also seems clear it created the conditions, set the stage for the immense struggles Venezuela continues to face today.
So, looking back over this deep dive, what are the key takeaways, these
Yeah.
sort of underlying factors?
Well, I think several things stand out from the analysis. First, that paradox of the oil boom, huge wealth, but it didn't lead to sustainable development, maybe even hindered it.
The resource curse idea?
Sort of,
Yeah.
yeah. Then the systematic suppression of opposition and independent institutions.
Okay.
Third, those deeply entrenched patterns of corruption and mismanagement, particularly around PDVSA.
Right. Fourth, the steadily increasing political power and influence of the military. And finally, perhaps overarching all of it, the fundamental failure to build an economy that wasn't just dangerously dependent on that single volatile commodity oil.
And hopefully, for you listening, understanding these deeper currents, these less obvious factors that our source material brings to light.
Gives you a much richer, more nuanced view.
Yeah, it helps you move beyond maybe the simplistic hero-villain narratives you sometimes hear about Chavez and Venezuela. It's a really critical global issue, and the complexity matters.
It really does. Which maybe prompts a final thought for reflection.
Go on.
Considering Venezuela's extreme, almost total reliance on oil, what broader lessons can we draw from this? For other nations, maybe rich in one particular resource?
About the potential pitfalls.
Yeah.
The risks of that resource wealth.
Exactly. The risks of not diversifying it. And maybe also, how does this whole Venezuelan case study inform our understanding of what happens long term when political power gets really concentrated?
When democratic institutions get weakened.
Yes. What are the lasting consequences? It's definitely something worth thinking about as we look at different countries and their paths around the world.